Good evening. My name is Jeremy Morrison, and I'm one of the rabbis here at Temple Israel. If you are new to our congregation, I welcome you to this extraordinary community. And I want to offer a particular word of welcome to Bill Gabovich, the president of the Jewish Community Relations Council, Nadish, the associate director of the JCRC, State Senator Will Brownsberger, State Representative Kay Kahn, State Representative Dave Rogers, and Ellen Morrissey, Congressional aide to Representative Markey. I hope that I have not missed anyone, and we're always grateful when our community and political leaders join us, and especially when they let us know that they will be among us. So we welcome you. Our gathering tonight coincides with our annual reading of the Torah portion Vayigash. The opening of this portion contains the climax of the story of Joseph, in which Judah confronts his younger brother with a carefully constructed account of his family's past. It is a speech that provokes an emotional reaction from Joseph, and one that ultimately leads to reconciliation among Jacob's children. Vayigash alav Yehudah. Judah drew near to Joseph. Vayigash is a word that means to approach, to encounter, or to draw near. In light of the complicated past that exists between Judah and Joseph, a past replete with pitfalls, alienation, and miscommunication, a well-known midrash explores the moment of tension implicit in Judah's actions and wonders. Was Judah drawing near to Joseph in order to do battle, to engage in reconciliation, or to offer words of prayer? During the past 15 months, members of our congregation have approached one another in order to explore the complexities of our individual and communal relationships with Israel, both as people and as place. Our congregational project, which will continue through the spring of 2014, was motivated by genuine concern for an attenuation of the ties that connect us as American Jews to Israel and to its Jewish communities. Through our communal conversations, courses, guest lectures, and travel opportunities, we have begun to confront feelings of alienation on the part of many congregants. We have promoted reconciliation within a community comprised of diverse political views. And we are now beginning to explore ways of becoming engaged with local and national efforts to promote peace, security, and equality, both within Israel and between Israel and its neighbors. Tonight's event is a component of this new stage in our project. Since the inception of this concerted effort last fall, our gatherings have been characterized by a spirit of conciliation and of tempered hope. Through adhering to rules of civil discourse, we have not done battle over our differences and have avoided the pitfalls of heated rhetoric that have often marred these types of communal gatherings. Tonight will be no different. If you are new to this community or an infrequent participant, I hope that you have joined us on this evening with the intention of learning and with a commitment to civility. As always, within Temple Israel, it is okay to disagree or to vouch for a different point of view, but I urge you to disagree without being disagreeable. After our speaker's presentation, which will last approximately 30 to 40 minutes, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. To that end, and in just a minute, we will begin distributing cards to those who would like to pose a question. After you've written down a question, please pass it along to the aisle of your row, and members of our Adult Education Committee will collect them. In turn, my clergy colleagues and I will collate them and pose a series of questions at the appropriate time in our program. Please do understand that if you submit a question, we will only have time for a few of them, but afterwards, we promise that we will give all of the index cards, all of the questions, to Jeremy Ben-Ami. Vayigash elav Yehudah. Judah drew near to Joseph. So was Judah drawing near to Joseph in order to do battle, to engage in reconciliation, or to offer words of prayer? I won't in this instance attempt to answer that question, but I will offer this prayer. Eternal One, teach us to listen with an open ear, to speak with a kind tongue, and to engage in a spirit of well-being and of peace. And now, to introduce the other Jeremy, who will be speaking tonight, it is my pleasure to invite to our bima Howard Wishney, a member of our Adult Education Committee. And throughout the course of our interactions, first, please turn off your cell phones. I will wait. And refrain from taking photos as well.
Good evening, and welcome to all of you who've come out on this cold and rainy night to participate in this evening's presentation. This is one of a series of talks developed by the Temple Israel Adult Education Committee in conjunction with the clergy. It is an attempt to provide an opportunity for the congregation and guests to hear the different perspectives held by the American organizations that support Israel. We Jews are known as a people who engage in intense discussions that include widely divergent opinions. Such dialogues are vital if we are to avoid becoming locked into our own narrow perspectives. Over the centuries, the capacity to hear, discuss, and learn from initially opposing opinions has helped us to survive. For everyone concerned about the future of Israel as a Jewish democracy, listening to the range of speakers scheduled for this and subsequent evenings is vital to this ongoing dialogue. In 1958, I spent 10 weeks in Israel, amazed and impressed by the people, the energy, and the commitment to democratic values. Yet even then, I was worried about the hostility of Israel's neighbors, and I worried also about the manifest attitudes of the Israelis towards the Israeli Arabs and their surrounding nations. In 1967, when war broke out, a number of surgeons and anesthesiologists from my hospital immediately flew to Israel. Although my first child had just been born, I signed up to go the next night. We were never called. They didn't need us. They were doing well. So while I disagree with current policies of the Israeli government, I want Israel to survive and flourish and return to its democratic and less authoritarian ways. Yes, I'm a member of J Street, and I have that perspective. J Street is an American voice that believes Israel's future and security depend upon a negotiated, secure, two-state solution. This view is supported by a number of retired generals, heads of Mossad, former heads of Mossad and Shin Bet, as well as politicians. With these issues in mind, we are privileged tonight to have with us Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president and founder of J Street, who will discuss and answer questions about the pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-two-state solution perspective. For those Temple Israel members who are interested in J Street and the formation of a group at Temple Israel that is informed and participates in J Street activities, we will have a meeting on Sunday, January 13th at 10 a.m. at Temple Israel. We will have information at the table in the atrium, and you can stop there on the way out to receive it. Jeremy Ben-Ami brings to his role at J Street deep experience in American politics and government and a passionate commitment to the State of Israel. Jeremy's family connection to Israel goes back 130 years to the first Aliyah, when his great-grandparents were among the first settlers in Petah Tikva. His grandparents were one of the founding families of Tel Aviv, His father was an activist and a leader in Irgun, an organization some thought of as terrorist, that worked for Israel's independence and was not favored by the British. They rescued Jews from Europe during World War II. Jeremy served in the mid-1990s as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to President Bill Clinton. He worked on many national, state, and local campaigns. For 3 years in the 1990s, Jeremy lived in Israel, where he started a consulting firm with Israeli nonprofit organizations and politicians. In 2004, he was Howard Dean's National Policy Director. For 3 years, he was chosen by America's Jewish weekly paper, The Forward, known by many of you as the Fovitz, as part of the Forward 50, the paper's compilation of the most influential American Jews. He was one of 50 People of the Decade selected by Haaretz, the Israeli daily paper, and the Jerusalem Post included him in its list of the 50 most influential American Jews. Jeremy received a law degree from New York University and is a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Relations at Princeton University. As president of J Street and a leader of America's Jewish community, Jeremy is a proud and prominent voice calling attention to the urgency of Israel's reaching a two-state resolution of its conflict with the Palestinians. He is the author of A New Voice for Israel, which is on sale in the lobby. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeremy Ben-Ami. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Howard. And thank you so much to Temple Israel of Boston for this invitation and for the ambitious effort that you are undertaking to engage your congregation in a broad-based discussion of Israel. Thank you and congratulations to Rabbis Friedman and Morrison and to the rest of the clergy and to the synagogue leadership. We were discussing earlier that we do wish that this kind of effort were more widespread across the American Jewish community, and this community and the synagogue, you should be extremely proud and pleased with your community and with your leadership for the effort that you have undertaken. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of great staff and leadership of J Street here in the Boston area. They're here in the audience tonight. Our regional organizer, Adam Steinberg, can just raise his hand and say hello. Also, Jeanette Hillis-Jaffe, who many of you know has been our regional political director, is somewhere in the audience. She has been central to our work here for the last 3 years, and this is her last week with J Street, so I thank her for her terrific work. Also in the audience are a number of leaders and active members of J Street in the Boston community. We have several thousand J Street supporters in this community and some of the most vibrant and wonderful activists and leaders, and I thank you for all of your work. I thank all of you for this deep commitment. As Howard said, I am at heart a fourth-generation Israeli, with my great-grandparents having made that journey from Russia to Palestine in 1882, and the deep roots that my family has all across the state of Israel today. They have been pioneers, builders, fighters. They have worked to create what I consider to be a wonderful, modern miracle, the rebirth of the state of the Jewish people after 2,000 years. And I just thank all of you for the commitment that you are showing by engaging in this conversation and attempting to grapple with what I believe are some of the most challenging times that we have experienced in the relationship between Jewish Americans and our family and friends who live and are fighting for the survival and the security of the State of Israel. My talk this evening will center on what I see as the fundamental challenge to Israel in the coming generation. It is the failure to resolve the conflict between the Jewish and the Palestinian people who live together in the land of Israel. Today, approximately 12 million people inhabit the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. About half of them are Jewish, and half of them are not. Within only a few years, there will be more Palestinians than Jews in this land. And this presents those of us who want Israel to be the secure, democratic national home of the Jewish people with a fundamental choice among three things. One, control of all of that land. Two, respect for democracy. And three, the continued Jewish character of the state. And either Israel gives up control of some of this land and agrees to the creation of a national home for the Palestinian people, or there will be only one state. And that state will have to make a terrible choice. Either it will choose to be fully democratic and give everybody who lives there the right to vote, in which case the majority of non-Jews will run the state, or it will choose to deny the majority their full democratic rights in order to remain under Jewish rule. The only way for Israel to remain both Jewish in nature and democratic in character is to reach a two-state resolution to its conflict with the Palestinian people. Failure to grant the Palestinian people a viable, contiguous state to which they agree will leave Israel deeply alienated from its neighbors and isolated from the international community. And we saw a glimpse of what that isolation looks like in the United Nations vote last month, in which Israel and the United States together, for that matter, were on the losing end of a 138-9 decision to grant upgraded status to the Palestinians in the General Assembly. This, my friends, is the central challenge facing Israel in our generation. And it is a challenge that Israel must cope with even in a time of immense uncertainty and utter chaos on all of its borders. Tour with me briefly from Israel's southern borders to the north. In Egypt, we watch as a struggle between Islamists and more politically liberal forces is playing out in the streets of Cairo even as we speak. Sinai is devolving into a no-man's land where terrorists are gaining the upper hand. Gaza is under the control of Hamas, which regularly fires rockets at Israeli civilians and whose leaders are calling openly for Israel's destruction. In Jordan, our good friend, the king, is facing growing rumbles of unrest. In Syria, the civil war has yet to come to a decisive end, but the country stands a reasonable chance of disintegrating and emerging as a stronghold for al-Qaeda terror. And finally, in Lebanon, decades of civil war and instability have allowed Hezbollah to establish itself as the strongest military and political force in the country, with tens of thousands of rockets aimed directly at Israel. This is the neighborhood that our ancestors chose to live in. This is also the regional context in which Israel must face the existential choice I spoke of earlier, and I haven't even mentioned Iran and its quest for nuclear weapons. So let's take a look not outside Israel's borders, but inside. Let's take a look at the important changes that are taking place within Israel itself, and specifically at the significant rightward shift that is happening in Israel's internal politics as it's heading towards elections in January. The unified Knesset candidate list that was put forward by Bibi Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman is likely to get 35 to 40 seats in the next 120-member Knesset, and it is almost certain to form the next government. Within the Likud party itself, relative moderates like Dan Meridor, Benny Begin, and Mickey Eitan are being pushed to the sidelines, and more radical forces, names you may not know, like Danny Danon and Moshe Feiglin, a former follower of Meir Kahane, are taking center stage. In fact, only 2 members of the Likud's list for the Knesset in this upcoming election are public supporters of a 2-state solution, and one of them is Bibi Netanyahu. The anti-democratic forces in Avigdor Lieberman's party that were not able to pass their full agenda in the last Knesset will now be the ruling party. And they will have a surging party even further to their right, called the National Home, with whom to partner in passing their agenda. Meanwhile, on the center left, there is fracture and division. 3 parties, Tzipi Livni's new party called the Movement, Labor, and Yair Lapid's new party, will also likely win between 35 and 40 seats together. But they won't be able to form a coalition because of their internal divisions, and the balance of seats are held either by the radical right or by the ultra-Orthodox. So even though there's a majority still to this day among the Israeli public that supports 2 states, there's no way to make the electoral math work to form a government that will actually push forward toward achieving a 2-state solution unless there is serious reform of the Israeli electoral system. But those who are going to win are the ones who benefit from the system as it is, so where is the incentive for change? So even though a majority of Israelis support a 2-state solution, we see Israeli politics moving sharply to the right and power shifting to those who favor a 1-state solution. Now let's look at the Palestinian side. There, I see the impending collapse of the moderate Palestinian leadership that for 20 years has been open to the 2-state solution and willing to resolve the conflict through peaceful negotiations. I want to share with you that I am petrified that we are about to witness the closing of the window on the negotiated resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the near term. In 2013, if Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas does not sense that there is real and significant movement, serious movement, towards a new diplomatic initiative, I expect him to take one or more of the following actions. First, to pursue further applications within the international context, either by joining other international organizations at the UN or elsewhere. Second, to pursue legal remedies at the International Criminal Court. Third, to pursue political reconciliation with Hamas. And finally, to dismantle the Palestinian Authority and symbolically hand the keys to West Bank administration back to Israel, saying essentially, you don't want us to have our own state? Fine. We are happy to be Israelis. Now let us vote. None of these scenarios is good for those of us who wish to see a secure, Jewish, and democratic Israel. And it all, to my mind, reinforces the absolute urgency that there be diplomatic progress in 2013. As I read the region, either there is a serious push for a 2-state solution from the outside in the coming months, or we risk seeing a slide towards confrontation and conflict on a scale we haven't seen before, with a real risk in this volatile regional context that I laid out earlier of a regional war with serious loss of life and bloodshed. With that uplifting assessment, I'll turn my attention back to this country. I find it startling, in light of the developments that I've just outlined in the region, how the conversation on these issues, both in American politics and in the American Jewish community, remains so fundamentally out of step with what is actually happening on the ground. In Washington, all we have to do is take a look at the congressional reaction to last month's UN vote. Within days of the UN vote, Senate and House leaders set in motion efforts on a bipartisan basis. If you were missing bipartisanship in Washington, luckily you found the one issue on which Republicans and Democrats are going to come together. And those efforts were designed to, quote unquote, punish the Palestinians for daring to go to the United Nations. Resolutions and letters are circulating as we speak to close the PLO's diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C., and efforts are about to start again to cut aid to the Palestinian Authority. This sort of reaction to consider punishing those elements of Palestinian politics and society with whom it is possible to talk and who openly recognize Israel and seek a two-state solution is, to my mind, nothing short of ludicrous. Instead of looking for ways to promote the standing and advance the interests of the moderate political forces in Palestinian politics and society, we are looking for ways to punish them. Meanwhile, their opponents, the ones who are firing rockets and calling for Israel's destruction, are gaining in stature with their people because they look like the ones who are actually resisting rather than facilitating an ongoing occupation. This dynamic in Washington of blind support for Israeli government action and blind criticism of any Palestinian action is out of date, and it is damaging to American interests and credibility. Meanwhile, in the established Jewish community, we see organizations like AIPAC leading the charge in Congress for these measures. We see a continued focus on delegitimizing Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, his political party, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the body that is charged with negotiating on behalf of the Palestinian people, when these are precisely the forces that made the decision decades ago to accept nonviolence and to attempt to resolve their conflict with Israel peacefully. They are precisely the leadership that we have asked for from the Palestinian side, and we will rue the day that we help to push these moderate forces from the scene and help pave the way for Hamas and those more extreme. There is a knee-jerk quality to the institutional reaction of the American Jewish community, a tendency to view the situation purely in black and white, when the reality is so much more complex. Even worse, there's a troubling tendency to want to shut down those who disagree rather than to permit an open discussion of what's going on. So where does J Street fit into this incredibly depressing picture? Let me talk for a few minutes about who we are and what we can do to put things on the right course. We started J Street, as Howard said, about 4 years ago to provide a voice and a home for pro-Israel Americans who recognize that the survival of Israel as a secure, democratic, and Jewish nation depends on achieving a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our starting principle is that if Israel must choose among the land, its democratic character, and its Jewish identity, then it must give up some of the land so that there can be two states, one Jewish and democratic, the other Palestinian, living side by side in peace and security. Further, we believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict won't be resolved by simply depending on the two sides themselves to sit down and work it out in so-called direct talks. We believe there is a vital role for the United States to play as a mediator, to bring the sides together, and to play an active role in forging agreement. Just as in a bitter divorce, you don't tell the husband and the wife to go into a room alone and work it out between themselves, these parties need a mediator who will work with them, often separately, to bridge the gaps and develop arrangements that allow for an amicable divorce. We see this mediating role as the ultimate act of friendship that the U.S. can provide to Israel. And rather than defining pro-Israel to mean unquestioning support for the government of Israel, we define it as active, urgent action to facilitate a two-state solution. We don't believe that to be pro-Israel, you have to be anti-Palestinian. In fact, to favor the creation of a Palestinian state is a quintessentially pro-Israel position, as Israel's very survival depends on that state's creation. Further, we do not buy that to criticize the policies of the government of Israel means that you are anti-Israel. You can love the state of Israel and its people, as we at J Street do, as friends, as family, and still disagree with the policies of its government. We believe that a vibrant, open discussion about Israel requires talking about all of the incredible things that Israel has achieved, all of the incredible contributions it has made to the world in terms of technology, medicine, culture, and the arts. It requires recognizing the miracle that is Israel's very existence and its rebirth. But it also requires acknowledging the problems and the challenges that face the country, from the ongoing occupation of millions of Palestinians and the denial of their right to freedom and self-determination. It requires an open conversation about what is happening on the West Bank regarding civil and human rights. But it also requires a very open discussion of the record and history of terror and violence that have been important reasons for the very security measures that have been taken and call those rights into question. These are complex issues, and they can't be presented simply in black and white. At J Street, we believe that the Jewish community in the United States will be stronger when we allow these issues to be discussed and when criticism of Israeli policy is accepted as being as mainstream as blanket endorsement of that government's policy. Finally, we believe that the Jewish community needs to apply the very same values and standards to the behavior of the Jewish people in Israel that we apply to all other people around the world. Jewish Americans are understandably extraordinarily proud of the values on which we have been raised. We do believe that it is our role to repair the world, to seek peace and pursue it, and to be a light unto the nations. We raise our children to believe that they should not treat other people the way that we would not want to be treated ourselves. But as Peter Beinart has so eloquently challenged us, we make a real mistake when we tell those same children that they have to check their Jewish values at the door of Zionism. These are the values on which we founded J Street, and in 4 years, I am proud that we have grown from a basement startup with 2 staff, 1 laptop, and no money, into a national force in Israel advocacy, representing 180,000 supporters with a $7 million budget, 50 local groups, a campus program at 60 colleges and universities, and a rabbinic cabinet with over 650 members. We have a political arm that is the largest pro-Israel PAC in the country, that endorsed 71 candidates for the House and Senate in the last election, of whom 70 won, and for whom we raised $1.8 million. We have done all this with J Street because we believe that if there is going to be a two-state solution to this conflict, it is only going to come about with American help, and that the United States will only provide that help and that leadership if our politicians and policymakers believe that they have political support from the Jewish community to engage. So that leads me to the final question that I want to address tonight. Given the bleak context that I laid out, given the array of challenges facing the President of the United States, what exactly is it that we want President Obama to do if he were to decide to make a serious effort to resolve this conflict in his second term? I'm sure many in this audience have heard the claim that there is little that the President can do at this point to resolve the conflict. You've heard people say, we can't want peace more than the parties themselves. You've heard the President's busy with other burning priorities, and he should just tell the parties to call us when they're serious. It's true. There are a host of other problems facing this country, domestic and international. The President's plate is full, but few international challenges are as strategically significant to the United States as this one. The challenge for those of us who make the case that this is a strategic priority is to outline exactly what it is that we want the President to do. 2 sets of answers are provided in recently published books. One is a compilation of essays edited by former Ambassador to Israel Dan Kurtzer called Pathways to Peace. Another just happens to be my own, where I outline in an appendix in a memo to the President what he can do. And I'd urge you to look at either book to get a more detailed sense of what specifically Ambassador Kurtzer and I are recommending But let me briefly summarize the key issues. First, the president needs to signal America's firm commitment publicly to lead a serious new effort to resolve the conflict. Simply giving that signal in the coming months will be critical to shaping both the Israeli and the Palestinian political context for the coming year. Second, he needs to put some early effort into building a robust international coalition behind a new effort to resolve the conflict. It's an effort that should encompass not only traditional partners like the Europeans and Russians, but Arab nations like a newly resurgent Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. And a real effort should be made to re-engage Turkey as well. Third, the president needs to put forward a framework for negotiations that has the clear and strong backing of this international coalition. That framework must include a set of parameters to guide negotiations on the core issues, everything from borders and security, settlements and refugees, Jerusalem and water. The parameters for reaching resolution to this conflict are well known. They have been laid out in numerous model peace agreements, in academic studies, and in actual negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, either in and around Camp David and Taba, or between Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen following Annapolis. The framework that the president puts forward needs to have a clear timeline for reaching a conclusion and commit to public monitoring of progress toward agreed-upon milestones. Next, the president has to go to Israel and to the region. He should speak directly to the Israeli and Palestinian publics. He should lay out his plan, the parameters, and the timeline, and then issue an invitation on behalf of the international community to a new international gathering. Maybe it's in Paris, maybe in Moscow or Madrid, where the entire world will expect both parties to show up for talks based on these parameters with a clear timeline for moving forward. There should be no preconditions for these negotiations other than acceptance of the parameters laid out by the international community. Finally, he should announce that he is appointing a new special envoy of stature who will bring a new approach and energy to the task and will stay in the region with a significant staff and commitment of resources to work with the parties to help them close their gaps and bridge differences following the international gathering and until the conclusion of an agreement. Those of us who care deeply about the survival of the State of Israel, its security, and its democratic and Jewish character should rally behind such a proposal and press the president urgently to engage. That's what we at J Street will be doing in the weeks and months ahead. We call this effort Our Time to Lead. Under that banner, we'll be urging the president to step out boldly with a new initiative along these lines. And we'll be fighting the unproductive efforts in Congress that set back the chances of peace, such as trying to close the PLO mission in Washington or to cut funding for the Palestinian Authority. The real beneficiary of those efforts isn't Israel, it's Hamas and the other rejectionist forces who will gain every time those who stand for nonviolence and diplomacy lose. The status quo is unsustainable. The calm on the West Bank must not be mistaken for stability. It only masks the growing frustration and anger below. The situation today is ripe for a spark that ignites a conflagration that will consume the status quo. Either the president acts now to head off that conflagration, or he will be forced to act once it breaks out to try to put the pieces back together again. Let me say, in closing, that I recognize that among my friends and allies in the pro-Israel, pro-peace camp, there is a growing sense of despair and of hopelessness. I see this in Israel, and I see it here in the United States. Many say the time has run out on the two-state solution. They say that the country that Israel is becoming is not a country that they want anything to do with anymore. They experience the conversation about Israel in the established Jewish community here, and it just seems so desperately out of touch with what's actually happening on the ground in Israel, and they withdraw. My message to those who share the values and the views of the center-left in Israel is that I cannot offer you hope. Things are going in the wrong direction. it is only a matter of time till one of a number of possible bad outcomes comes to pass if we sit back and do nothing. The status quo is unsustainable, and at some point, yes, a spark will ignite what is an extraordinarily combustible situation, but the answer isn't to give up. The answer isn't to beg someone you know for hope. The answer is to stand up. The answer is to step forward. The answer is to sign up and to get engaged. The majority of the people on all sides actually share a common view of how to end this conflict. They share a belief in two states for two peoples. They share a desire for a peaceful world for their kids and their grandchildren. They want to figure out how to compromise in order to live together in peace and security. But it's not going to happen if we give up and we abandon the field to those on the extremes who think they can win it all for their side. I hope you will see the urgency of the moment. I hope you will see the possibility for change, and I hope you will see the need for engagement. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. We were asked by the organizers of J Street to ensure that we pose to Jeremy very challenging questions. My clergy colleagues are intently sorting all of the questions, many of which are more than just a question. There's a paragraph or two written on this size page in small writing. But we're going to do our very best to not just pose challenging questions, but questions representative of a range of issues, and in the hopes that we'll just keep enlarging our understanding of J Street and learn more about the complexities in the Middle East. So here's the first question. In what ways has J Street diverged from the lobbying agenda of AIPAC, and if you could speak more specifically about its common agendas between the two organizations?
The common ground between the two organizations is a deep love and caring for the future of the State of Israel. What separates us, I think, is the tactical approach that we've taken. The approach of AIPAC, which has its roots in 50 or 60 years of history, is to build a base of support for the U.S.-Israel relationship and to stand guard for that special relationship, to ensure Israel's qualitative military edge, to ensure that there's a deep understanding in Congress of the needs of the state and the government of Israel. I think AIPAC would present, and you'll hear from an AIPAC speaker in a few weeks, that their agenda is to support the government of the state of Israel and its policies. And that is an important agenda. Our agenda is to achieve a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We will call out and we will criticize the policies of Israel, of the Palestinians, of the United States, of anybody who is acting in a way that doesn't advance the agenda of achieving two states, because we view failure, as I said in my remarks, failure to achieve two states as the existential challenge for Israel in the generation ahead. So we have a prescriptive agenda, which is to try to get the United States government to play a proactive role in bringing peace about. And I think that the AIPAC agenda is very much about ensuring the strength of the relationship between the two countries.
The leader of Hamas just said, quote, "never," unquote, yet again. How can you ever expect to make peace with such an opponent?
I don't. And that's the gist of my remarks. We have a choice. There's a leader in Ramallah I'm not speaking loudly enough? There's a leader in Ramallah who believes in a two-state solution and who recognizes the state of Israel and has just on Israeli TV recently talked about the recognition on his part that he's not returning to Sfat where he was born. And then there's a leader in Gaza who we heard what his remarks are. And we, as the Jewish people, both in Israel and in this community, have a choice. We can work to justify the efforts that Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad and others are making to try to achieve a two-state solution, or we can reject them and we can close down their mission and we can cut the aid and we can call them all sorts of names because they're not actually Zionists themselves, and end up with Hamas. So I don't want to make peace with Hamas. I want to make peace with Palestinians who are ready to recognize Israel and renounce violence and accept a two-state solution. Perhaps there are those in Hamas who, if they saw a peace deal between the West Bank and Israel, who saw that you could actually get freedom and dignity and self-determination by working with Israel, maybe they would come around too. So my hope is that one day they'll join the political process, they'll give up on violence, they'll renounce terror, they'll recognize Israel's right to exist, and they'll join the Palestinian political process. And you know what? Those who don't will need to be defeated. And they'll need to be defeated by a powerful and real Palestinian state that controls its internal security and controls its extreme elements the way that good states do. So no, I don't think you can make peace with somebody who says there'll never be a Jewish presence between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. That point of view is what we're fighting against, and I hope that we can do it by making peace with those who are willing to do it.
Do you harbor any concerns that the Palestinian Authority really actually wants a two-stage solution rather than a two-state solution? And if not, why not?
You know, ultimately, I think we have to make a decision. What kind of risks are we willing to take? There's no guarantees in life. If you make a deal with the Palestinian Authority, you make a deal with Mahmoud Abbas and you sign it and there's an international backing to it and there's a public referendum and a public commitment on both sides, is there a possibility that 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now there might be some reneging on one side or the other? Possibly. So that's a risk. Does that justify doing nothing? Is there no risk in doing nothing? In my view, what I laid out in my talk, the risk of doing nothing is an unsustainable status quo that leads Israel off a cliff, losing its Jewish and democratic nature. So those are the choices: an imperfect guarantee that has some risk, or a fairly bleak status quo if you do nothing. So I wish that there were a perfect choice with a 100% guarantee, but we have to make a choice as a people, and Israel has to make a choice as a nation about which path it's going to choose.
Is a Jewish state a democracy? Isn't this a contradiction in terms?
It is a challenge. I think that squaring the notion of being Jewish and democratic in nature and character is the fundamental challenge that I hope Israel will have to grapple with once it resolves this conflict. What is the proper role of religion in a nation of the Jewish people? How much control should there be for rabbis over who gets married and who's a Jew and who's a citizen? How much separation should there be? Should there be a constitution? Should there be preferences in immigration for Jews from around the world and not for others? You know, those are very, very difficult questions. I come down on the side of there must be a law of return. That's what Israel is. It is the ultimate safe haven for the Jewish people. And so if there's a preference for Jewish people in immigration to a state of Israel, I'm in favor of that, and I believe in that. Should all citizens of the state be treated equally? Absolutely. Should there be discrimination on the basis of race, religion? No. Is there now? Yes. Is it an imperfect society? Yes. Are all societies imperfect? Yes. So that's the big challenge. I hope that we get to that point, because first we have a bigger hurdle, which is we've got to overcome this conflict.
How do you explain that there is no cousin organization called P Street? Perhaps it is time to recognize there is no legitimate partner in peace, unfortunately.
We work very, very closely with a number of Arab American and Palestinian American organizations. This is simply a red herring that's often put out there. We work with the Arab American Institute. We've sponsored numerous events with them, promoting the Arab Peace Initiative, promoting a two-state solution. We work with the American Task Force for Palestine, the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, a whole range of groups that are Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim that all support peace and want nothing more for their people than I want for my people, which is a secure future for their children and grandchildren.
What do you think is the plan of the far right in Israel to reach peace with Palestinians?
You know, there's been talk. I mean, some people are laughing, but, there have been those who have laid out what a vision looks like. Moshe Aharon's, Ruby Rivlin. There are people on the Israeli political right who have laid out their view that there could be some form of autonomous regions. I think in other contexts they were called homelands or Bantustans, but they're autonomous regions in which there is self-governance and people vote for governments that run their domestic affairs in those areas, and that should be satisfactory. It's a diminished level of rights, a diminished level of citizenship within a limited geographic area with responsibility for civil affairs. And I think that there's a view on the right that that's a sustainable and acceptable future. I don't think that the rest of the world will see it that way, and I hope that the majority in the American Jewish community wouldn't see it that way.
Should President Obama publicly oppose the incremental facts on the ground that the Israeli government creates by continuing to grow the West Bank settlements?
President Obama does oppose it and has vigorously and publicly opposed it. Obviously, his opposition hasn't been strong enough, and I think that the message needs to be sent loud and clear in a second term that if we are going to make progress along the lines that I laid out, that even if there isn't a public settlement freeze, there will have to be a cessation of settlement building activity during these negotiations if they're going to make progress. Alan Dershowitz laid out a wonderful proposal in the Wall Street Journal that I am happy to endorse. Some of you know that Alan and I have a contentious relationship, but we agree very much on his proposal, which is that President Abbas should drop the precondition for a settlement freeze in order for the negotiations to begin, but Prime Minister Netanyahu should, once negotiations do begin without preconditions, as a gesture of goodwill, stop building settlements for the duration of those negotiations. I think that that's a very good way to get out of the corner that both of them are in. And so I thank Alan for that contribution. I know that President Abbas actually signed his op-ed when Alan walked up to him and presented it. And I know that he then presented that signed op-ed to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I'm hopeful that maybe we can see some progress.
Before I pose the next question, I just want to give permission to our high school kids whose school program ends at 8:30. If you need to leave, if your rides are waiting, you have complete permission to go.
But if you're so engaged and excited by this program, you're more than welcome to stay.
That's true, too. That's true, too. You guys have been tremendous tonight, as always. So I'll just give one moment for that. Good. I'm also going to move out into this because I feel like we're having a little interaction.
I appreciate that.
2 Jeremys, 10 feet apart. I'll come back here to pose questions because they aren't mine. This one is, what can progressive Christian church groups in the U.S. do to best support efforts towards pro-Israel, pro-peace, and Palestinian civil rights?
There's a very, very important role for churches and church leadership to play. I think many of you are probably aware of the role that is played by the Christian Zionist movement when it comes to Israel issues in Washington, D.C. Perhaps the largest lobby when it comes to Israel in the United States today is not a Jewish organization. It is actually Christians United for Israel, which can mobilize tens of thousands of activists to come to Washington, D.C. And they are led by Pastor John Hagee, who's charities have been funding and supporting settlement construction on the West Bank. It is a vision of Israel that I think many of you know does not end well for the Jews. It is, I think, a sort of an unnatural, unholy, perhaps, alliance that has been struck. And so I would say to those Christians of goodwill who recognize that the teachings of your faith are teachings of peace and of caring for this holy land that we share, there's a very, very important role for Christian voices in Washington, D.C. to be heard on behalf of American leadership for peace in the Holy Land. And so I'd urge you to get involved. There's organizations like Churches for Middle East Peace. There's an evangelical group called Telos that is trying to counter the Kufi movement. So I do think it's an extraordinarily important voice that needs to be louder and needs to be raised.
Lately, given the entrenchment of Hamas in Gaza, I have wondered whether we need to start talking about a three-state solution, where at least two of them could make peace. Could you comment on that?
Well, I do think that there's more and more thought among Israelis in the center left that the deal that you strike initially will have to be with the forces in control of the West Bank. The issues, if you think about it, the issues that are really in contest relate to borders. There's no issue in Gaza. The border issues are all on the West Bank. Settlements, there's no longer any settlements in Gaza. They're on the West Bank. Jerusalem, again, a West Bank issue. Refugees, again, mostly going to be an issue of resettling on the West Bank. So most of the difficult and contentious water issues are with the West Bank. And so I do think there is talk about the need to perhaps do this in stages and to say that the provisions relating to Gaza and to the connective route between Gaza and the West Bank would only go into effect when Gaza comes within the political entity that is the Palestinian state and agrees to abide by the agreement, holds a public referendum, unites political leadership. But that also means that we as an American Jewish community are going to have to begin to process the notion that at some point, if you want Palestinian unity and you want to reach a full two-state solution, Hamas's political arm, much like the IRA's political arm, is going to have to put down its weapons and come within the political system. 30 years ago, it was heresy to talk about the PLO as a possible diplomatic partner, and today it's heresy to talk about Hamas potentially one day making that decision. But again, in terms of open conversations that we're going to have to start to have, one day, if there will be peace, there will be Palestinian reconciliation, and it will bring them together into a single political system. And then we have to hope that the Palestinian people will vote for the moderates who were able to deliver their state and not for the terrorists who were delivering rockets. And that's what we have to work for. And we have a say, I would argue, as the United States, as Israel, as Jews, by trying to help the moderates and make an agreement with them so that ultimately the appeal of the extremists is diminished.
There's water directly to your left if you would like it, or a cup underneath there. You got something? Good. Do you support international sanctions against Iran, against Israel? Why or why not?
We support sanctions against Iran to try to get it to stop the development of nuclear weapons capability. We are very much supportive of the President's notion that sanctions and diplomacy go together, that part of the goal of the pressure that those sanctions bring is to try to get this regime that has dedicated itself publicly to the conflict with Israel, to get that regime to change its ways and to come within the international system. So yes, we support sanctions on Iran. We do not support sanctions on Israel. We do not support cutting aid. We do not support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Some people call it BDS. We don't believe as a pro-Israel organization that that is the way in this context, that knowing Israel, knowing this conflict, that is the way we're going to make progress towards a resolution of the conflict.
What, if anything, is the responsibility on the part of Israelis, Israeli Jews, for listening to American Jews' sense of their own struggle that they face in these complexities, or with these complexities.
What's the responsibility of Israeli Jews? Well, look, it's Israeli's country. It's up to them. I mean, I always say that this is not our decision at the end of the day. Both the responsibility and ultimately the consequences are on those who live there. And so I think what we have an obligation to do as friends and as family, we have been an invaluable partner to Israelis in the creation, the building, and the defense of the State of Israel. And we have worked together hand in hand every step of the way over decades and generations. And I think that as friends, the obligation today for us is to flash the warning sign and to say loudly and clearly from every corner of this country that as we see it, what I laid out, this unsustainable status quo, threatens everything that we have worked on together. And that's what a good friend does. That's what family does. You try to call attention and try to help people to see the consequences of choices that they're making. But ultimately, the responsibility is theirs to make the decision. It's their country, and it's a democracy, and they get to vote. And if they're going to choose Bibi Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman and those further right, they will reap the consequences of the decisions that they make.
Why do you think Israel decided to assassinate Ahmed al-Jabari when he was in the midst of negotiations for a stronger ceasefire and with the negotiation, when he was involved in the negotiations for a stronger ceasefire and with the negotiation for Shalit's release?
That question is based on Gershon Baskin's blog post. For those who don't know, there's one person who holds that view, and he did post it on his blog, and I know it's made the rounds. There really has been no corroboration that there was anything along those lines happening in terms of negotiations for a longer-term ceasefire. Jabari was not viewed by anyone in Israel in the peace camp, really other than Gershon, as a moderate. So I just don't buy into that particular view.
Why don't we hear more about the actions of the liberal Israeli community and about their desires for a two-state solution?
The support for a two-state solution is very widespread in Israel. Polling continues to show that 70% of Jewish Israelis support the basic parameters of a two-state deal. But I would say that over the course of the last 10 to 20 years, that the vast majority of the supporters of a two-state solution have lost hope. In their narrative, and I understand this, they feel they gave up territory and withdrew from southern Lebanon and got rockets. They offered everything in their view at Camp David and got an intifada. And they pulled out of Gaza and got rockets. And so the peace camp and the ordinary average Israeli who supports two states basically said, why bother? This doesn't work. And life goes on. They've got a very secure last few years. There's been no acts of terror from the West Bank. There's a wall that prevents interaction, that doesn't really bring the occupation into the eyesight of most Israelis. And life goes on. The economy is good. The weather's great. Culture's good. So I sense, and you see it in the Israeli election right now, Tzipi Livni is trying her best to inject this set of issues into the national campaign. But a lot of the left, Sheli Yakimovich and the Labor Party, Yair Lapid, who's trying not to appear left and calls himself center, with the Yesh Atid party, is talking about electoral reform and education. But they're avoiding talking about these issues because they don't think the public wants to hear about it. So I think one of the sadder things today in Israel is the lack of recognition of, essentially sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano. And I think, again, this is one of the roles that we, as American Jews, who care deeply about those folks and who don't want to see the volcano erupt right on them, we have an obligation to try to help to shine some light on this reality, to give some perspective from here as to where we're headed.
We're going to employ the, Broadway principle of leaving them wanting more. So I'm going to ask, we're going to ask two more questions, okay? First, do you believe that the Palestinian state should be demilitarized and that Israel should control its borders?
The Palestinian state should be demilitarized. Every agreement that has been negotiated and all of the model peace agreements have presumed a demilitarized state. There would, of course, be an internal police force, but no armed forces, no air force, that sort of thing. And in terms of control of the borders, the Palestinians have indicated a willingness to have an international force on the borders, with perhaps some Israeli presence that would be withdrawn over time. Whether that's 1 year or 25 years is probably where the negotiation is going to take place, and I would imagine there will always be some international presence on the border of the new Palestinian state.
Could you describe the J Street's policy regarding the dismantling of settlements and their viability within a Palestinian state?
We believe that the ultimate parameters of a two-state solution would essentially keep 70 to 80% of the settlers within the borders of the State of Israel by expanding the border in exchange for swaps of land of equal value and size. That's the principle that President Obama laid down in his May 2001 speech that generated a fair amount of uproar, as you may have heard. That is the basic principle that Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen were negotiating in 2008. It's certainly what J Street believes. You would need to relocate somewhere between 70 to 100,000 settlers. It is my personal opinion that no man-made obstacle can't be unmade. So whether it's a building or a road or a fence, if that's what needs to be moved in order to achieve peace, that's what's going to have to be moved. And that includes people's homes, and we have to recognize what a terrible tragedy that's going to be for them, and we need to have some sympathy for those who will need to be moved and to not look at them all, let's say, as somehow the perpetrators of evil, but as people who need to come back home. And that's the way we need to welcome them. And that's, I think, going to be very, very important if there ever is to be peace, is to not turn that settler community into some form of enemy or pariah, but to try to find a way to welcome them back to Israeli society.
Thank you very much. I want to invite all of you to return here on Monday, January 28th, when Eric Geiser, the Regional Director of AIPAC, will be with us. And then again on March 4th, a Monday as well, David Bernstein, the Executive Director of the David Project, will be speaking. And finally, on the 11th of April, a Thursday night, Anat Hoffman, the Director of the Israeli Religious Action Center, will be here in our sanctuary. And finally, we began our evening with a moment of reflection and in a moment a stance, an orientation of mourning. If you're a member of our congregation, we will provide an opportunity for collective expression of our grief and sorrow by offering prayers and saying Kaddish together here on Thursday, December 20th at 6:05 to 6:30, right here in the sanctuary. And for those who would like to come, but their children will be finishing up school that late afternoon, we will provide childcare in the library. So please come back for that if you would like, and thank you for being here tonight.